Hey, how's it going? This is Andrew from AccuTune Off-Road, here to talk to you guys about bypasses and what we do special to help you guys get the best experience possible. So in front of me today, we have Carbon Motorsports bypasses, which are high-end shocks that offer position-sensitive dampening for high-speed off-road use. Specifically, these are external bypasses, which have tubes on the outside diameter of the shock that allow for adjustment of both the compression and rebound zones independently. This is off their Ultra 4 race car. These work in conjunction with their coilovers to really control their chassis so that they can go as fast as possible while being as comfortable as possible throughout the entire race. So external bypasses you typically find on race cars, but you also see them on plenty of other vehicles like your pre-runners and Baja trucks, as well as your glamorous sand cars out there. When it comes to racing Ultra 4 and King of the Hammers, we're looking to help our customers get absolutely the perfect setup so they can make it throughout the entire race and hopefully bring home the checker flag. Yeah, when it comes to these bypasses specifically, these are off an Ultra 4 IFS car, but when it comes to bypasses in general, we have tons of experience all over. So with this customer specifically, he came to us actually with an F250 first. We tuned his F250 shocks, got them working. He loved the ride, brought us his Ultra 4 car, his solid axle car. And with that, we custom set up some bypasses for that car, got him out in the desert, got him tuned, got him racing, and got that car really fast. So no matter what platform you're working on, we have the experience to dial in the tunes for you. For these bypasses specifically, we worked with Carbon Motorsports and their 1,000 horsepower Ultra 4 car to really get the most out of that chassis. So for these bypasses, we had to get a ton of measurements from our customer just to make sure that they would fit and function the way we wanted them to. We started off with just the overall collapse and extended lengths, as well as their length at ride height. And when I say length, we're looking for the eye-to-eye length of the bolts themselves. After that, we're looking for the motion ratio that the customer has on their vehicle. To do that, we had to have them measure the control arms that they have on their vehicle, cycle the full suspension, and tell us how much wheel travel they're getting out of that shock travel. Next thing we looked for was the eyelet configurations that they needed on the front and the back. These are critical just because they have different options as far as the bolt sizes, diameters, lengths, and widths. So we had to get the correct tab width and shock spacers set in these shocks to make them fit, as well as the correct rod ends, because on the rear trailing arms, they sit deeper in the pocket, so that we had to do an extended rod end on them. And then the last, probably most important part as far as fitment on a vehicle was making sure that the tube orientation around the shock, along with the piggyback and cooler orientation, was set up correctly. If this is wrong, it will not fit on the vehicle properly, and you tend to run these tubes or some part of the shock into the chassis and damage both the shock and the vehicle. So on the front of Carbon Motorsports Ultra 4 car, we really wanted to get a large package on there. There's a ton of motion ratio built into the chassis itself, and there's a ton of wheel travel that he's using. So to do that, we had to get really creative. Unfortunately, we were still limited to a 3.5 bypass and a 2.5 coilover. In order to get these to fit that chassis, we really had to do a custom tube layout that really got extremely close to the upper control arm, so much so that we had to modify the upper control arm just to make it fit. Yeah, on these front bypasses, we did a lot of work to make the tune perfect. To do that, we added trim tubes, we added custom tube heights, we added custom tube layouts just to fit the chassis, and then we also added custom coolers. So the coolers allow the fluid to cycle through them on the rebound cycle in order to dissipate as much heat as possible during those really long races like King of the Hammers or even some of the desert races that he's run. So on these shocks specifically, we have trim tubes so that while you're working through your travel and you get all the way past the compression zones and into that last zone, it's called the bump zone. In that zone, we are really trying to control the chassis from bottoming out so that you do no damage to your truck. So these are 3.5 by 14 inch bypasses that we set up for the front of the Ultra 4 car. On these, we have 7 tubes. A little more unique in that it has 2 extra tubes added to it from its standard configuration. And with that, we have 3 compression tubes, 2 rebound tubes, as well as 2 trim tubes for the bump zone. The way the compression tubes work is that as the shaft is compressing into the shock, fluid is flowing out of the tube and into your adjuster. Your adjuster has a valve inside of it that we're controlling using the depth of this adjustment right here. On the rebound side, it's exactly the same, but coming out of the shock. So as the shock extends, the piston is pulling down the shock and is running the oil through the tube up to the adjuster and giving you the control with this adjustment here. The trim tubes themselves give us fine tuning adjustment. They are much smaller and they allow us to fine tune that bump zone. So these are 4.0 by 18 inch rear bypasses. These are set up to work alongside a 3.0 by 16 coilover. The rear of this chassis is much heavier, much larger, but also has more space. With that, we're allowed to put a larger shock in there so that we could get more travel, more cooling, and just more control over that chassis. On this car specifically, the rear tends to work a lot harder than the front, and so we really wanted to get as large of a shock as possible in there. With these rear bypasses, they're pretty similar to the front where they both have 7 tubes on them. This also has the trim tubes on the bump zone, as well as 3 compression tubes and 2 rebound tubes. This allows us a similar amount of control, but the zones are much different in that they're much longer for the different wheel travel that the rear has to cycle through. For the shocks, we have piggyback reservoirs on them. These shocks also come with the option to have a remote reservoir with a hose attached to them. This allows a fitment of your chassis no matter what it is. So on the rear setup, with the 3.0 coilover, we're actually able to obtain a lot more low speed control than we are out of a smaller shock. So it was great that we were able to use the larger shock in the rear that we weren't able to use in the front. So for this car, we chose a 4.0 by 18 inch bypass. There are some larger shocks, and Ian from Carbon Motorsports really did want a larger shock on his vehicle. Unfortunately, with the packaging, the weight of the vehicle, his motion ratio, and the travel that he has, there really was no reason to go larger. There is a detriment to running a larger shock. It becomes more unstable, harder to tune, and makes it more difficult overall to get the perfect platform. So on these 3.5 and 4.0 bypasses, they come with 1-inch bypass tubes. That is the largest available and gives us the most control over the chassis. On these bypasses specifically, we have trim tubes which are a 5/8 diameter. We don't need that extra large diameter to control the bump zone of these shocks. It is not necessary, and we just want a small amount of adjustment on these zones. On some of the smaller bypasses, like the 2.5 and 3.0 bypasses, they will come with 3/4 inch tubes. At an extra cost, we can typically upsize them to the larger tube that we want in order to gain the most tunability. With the 2.0 bypasses, you can get even smaller and go down to a 5/8 tube. We don't recommend a 2.0 bypass with 5/8 tubes, as typically you're not going to get much more performance out of them than you would just a smooth body shock. So when it comes to the tube layout of a bypass shock, it is incredibly important for 2 reasons. One is the fitment on the chassis itself, and the other is the tuning aspect. When it comes to the chassis fitment, the tube orientation around the body is what is most important. To get it to fit these chassis specifically, we have to customize where each tube lands on the body so that it clears things like your control arms, the tube work, your seats for some reason. On these shocks specifically, these coolers have a very specific orientation as well. This is to allow us to bolt them onto the chassis and get the coolers on the outside of the chassis where they're receiving airflow so that they can actually cool the shocks down. When it comes to tube placement, there are 2 important aspects to look at. One is the orientation around the body, and the other is the tube height on the body. The orientation is extremely critical for making sure that these bypasses fit your chassis well. So the tube heights are important because as you progress through the travel of the shock, you really get a different amount of control through each zone. And this allows us to really fine tune your suspension setup so that as you're going through the whoops, you have the most control possible. When it comes to going fast off-road, it is important to have the best shock package possible. At AccuTune Off-Road, we go through a lot of steps to make sure that that happens for you. That includes setting up bypasses and the custom nature of how we want them to work. We're here to help you whether you're working on your race car or your daily driver. No matter what, we're gonna get you the best ride possible. So when you're ready to order, give us a call or send us an email here at AccuTune Off-Road. We'll get you taken care of.